Greetings, this is a special program from ABC with Migzacho Derib. Ethiopia's relation with European countries goes back to the medieval period. By the end of the 20th century, European countries come together and form the European Union. The European Union is the supranational and political and economic union of 27 member states of European countries. Ethiopia's relation with those countries is very immense and very strategical. The strategic engagement and the diplomatic engagement, as well as the political and economic engagement that Ethiopia has with European countries, is so paramount. In today's special program, we examine the relationship between Ethiopia and the European Union. For this program, we invited His Excellency, the European Union's Ambassador to Ethiopia, Ambassador Roland Kobia. Do stay with us. Ambassador, welcome to the show and thank you for your time as well.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You have crisscrossed different continents, which is Africa, Europe, and Asia, and you do have also a rich experience. What do you think and what do you feel when you think of it?
Look, as you say, I have lived and worked for 25 years in Africa and in Asia. And for an Africanist, which I consider myself to be partly, Ethiopia is certainly one of the most interesting and fascinating countries to serve in. I work here, with the member states of the European Union. We have a big group. I think we are trying to develop, the best relations we can have under the circumstances. And Ethiopia is clearly, because of its history, its culture, its social fabric, the diversity of the country, an extraordinary, fascinating country. And I'm also very happy to be here with my family, who is very, very happy here.
Being the European Union's ambassador to Ethiopia, what is Ethiopia for European Union?
Apart from being the host of the African Union and being a major, country in the Horn of Africa with continental ramification, Ethiopia by itself is already an incredibly important country for the European Union. As you rightly mentioned in the introduction, we have relationships between Ethiopia and the European Union for 500 years. So the first country that established relations, that was Portugal, with Ethiopia, that was over 500 years ago. So I think this is a testimony of the extremely old, but also very strong ties that are actually binding Ethiopia and the Europeans. We are not, as Europeans, newcomers to Africa. We are not newcomers as in our partnership with Ethiopia. We are very long-standing partners and very deep partners together. And as you rightly said, for mutual interest. It is in the interest of Ethiopia, it is in our interest, and what is very important is finding the meeting point between us two, where we can have, a very good relationship.
The recent peace deal agreement is one of the points that we're going to discuss in the course of our discussion, which resulted from the 2 years bloody conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia. How do you see that conflict and its ramifications?
Look, first of all, we have to congratulate Ethiopia for the Pretoria Agreement and the cessation of hostilities that has been reached between the government of Ethiopia and the TPLF. I think that was a very important and constructive moment for the country. After 2 years of a fighting that has been, even Ethiopians admit that, a very difficult period with a lot of human suffering, a lot of casualties. So the fact of having reached an agreement that is, a process that will lead to lasting peace is very, very important. All the member states of the European Union have welcomed that agreement at a high level from the capitals, usually ministerial level, and so we have welcomed that as a watershed moment in the modern history of Ethiopia. Now, of course, what will be the most important part is the implementation of the agreement. The agreement is a very ambitious one. It has also very tight and ambitious deadlines to be met. What we see is that the agreement is not only ambitious in its deadlines, but in its contents. It covers many different areas. And we were, I must confess, very positively surprised to see that this agreement could be reached in such a small period, in such a short time. And this is all the credit to the two parties that have negotiated, but also of the African Union and of the countries that have been helping, the successful completion of this agreement. So now it's implementation time. What is reassuring to us, there are some delays, but that is totally normal. I have been active in peace processes for over 20 years in different countries, in Africa and in Asia, and the fact that you have delays is normal. So we should not be worried about that. What is important is that the parties are committed and that they continue to talk to each other. And now there have been discussions in Nairobi, there are discussions in Shire, there are many different formats of discussion, and that is the most important point, is that the two parties continue to have an interaction and try to find solutions.
As an ambassador and also as the one who is well experienced in negotiating different parties, those who are in conflict, you can take in Asia or South Africa that you have been familiar with, do you see any challenge that may hamper the implementation of this peace deal?
Look, the challenges are always many in any peace agreement, not only in this one, but in any peace agreement. I think this one is a difficult one because the war has been, not a war of a few weeks or a few months. It has been 2 years. It has also, a history to it that is very deep and that has put an imprint on the process. So I think it is a complicated deal. But what we find extremely reassuring is that we have seen the two parties being seriously committed to reach an agreement, acknowledging the fact that a negotiated political agreement was the only solution, that war could not continue. So I think this realization by the two parties themselves, because what I see as a constraint very often is that the parties are reaching an agreement upon pressure. And this is usually not good because it will not make the agreement lasting. You need the two parties to be convinced, both of them, that they need to make peace. And this was the case here. And we see that they continue to talk. But there will be constraints in terms of the deadlines, in terms of the difficulties that will be along the road. And again, having difficulties, having hurdles to jump over will be totally normal. What I'm a little bit concerned about now is the impatience of certain constituencies. And you see a number of criticism, you see a number of people who are, proliferating negative opinions about the agreement, either from inside Ethiopia or from abroad. And I think this is not fair, because now is the moment to support that agreement. We have to give the best chances for this agreement to work. And any sort of negativity towards we need to be demanding, of course, but any negativity will make things even more complicated for the agreement. So now it's time to support, to encourage, rather than to discourage.
The signing of the peace agreement, be it in Pretoria or in Nairobi, it was under the auspice of African Union. How do you see the role that African Union has played?
The African Union has been accepted by both parties as a mediator. So that was a good start. And as from the moment in which you have the two parties that are really willing to reach an agreement, and you have a mediator that is by and large accepted by the two parties, then you have a constellation of a situation which is conducive to an agreement. The African Union has developed its best efforts, I think, to try to help the parties reaching this agreement. We know that a number of countries in the region, in Africa, have also given support, and this is very good. The Americans have been involved as well. The EU was not invited, but we have given an external support for this agreement to be achieved. I think what the African Union has done is showing that African solutions to African problems is a reality, and this is something that we welcome. But of course, it should not remain a slogan. It should not remain a concept. The African solutions to African problems should continue even once the agreement is being signed. Now we have the agreement. As we said, it is implementation phase, and now the real work is starting now, I would say. 10 days of negotiation was a great achievement, but the real achievement will be to put this agreement into practice. And there, I think the support and the fact that a number of partners would accompany this implementation phase would still be very important.
There are thousands and thousands and millions of IDPs, those who have been displaced as a result of this conflict. There are also growth-driven IDPs also. How do you see to bring them back to their home and their original life vis-a-vis to the role that the European Union has to play its part also in supporting and assisting them?
Look, internally displaced persons and refugees are one of the many negative consequences of any conflict and war. And we have seen that this war has triggered a lot of IDPs internally. The figures we hear are very often, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of IDPs that have been the consequence of this war. So what do we want in the long term? I mean, once there will be a reinstallation of a secure environment in Ethiopia, I think what the people want is very important. What do they want? Do they want to go back to their lands, which is very often the case? And then we should, of course, create the conditions for them to go back and help them going back. And the EU, this is particularly an area in which the European Union and the member states are usually very active across the world. It's to help the people, getting back to their livelihoods, to their original and ancestors' places. I personally do not think that it's a good practice to keep IDPs for very, very long outside their lands. This is not what they want. They usually want to go back to their land, to farm again, to live normal lives within their own environment. And again, the EU can help with many other partners of the United Nations and others. But we should not create generations of IDPs that live actually, outside their own.
In the middle of this conflict, there are many critics that blame the government where unfettered humanitarian access were not to that extent or to the level it was expected. But in the aftermath of this signing of the peace agreement, different partners and the aid organizations are providing and supplying aid materials for the IDPs, especially in Tigray, Afar, and Amhara.
Look, since the very beginning of the conflict in November 2020, the EU has been crystal clear, has been consistent and coherent in its position that we regretted that there's a war, but that is something we cannot have a bearing on. That was the decisions of Ethiopia. But one thing that should happen was humanitarian access, because humanitarian access is not linked to politics. It is not linked to the conditions and the process of war. It is an emergency help for the people and notably civilians that are affected by the war. So we have always, for 2 years, pushed and promoted and advocated, for the greatest humanitarian access to be possible. It was not always possible, as we know. It has been complicated. But now that there's a peace agreement and that humanitarian aid is part of the peace agreement, very clearly, I think it's time now to step up and to make the full delivery of aid as quickly as possible, but also as easy as possible, because there are still difficulties for a number of partners to deliver the aid to all affected populations, not only in Tigray, but also in parts of Amhara, of Afar, and all the people that have been affected by this war deserve now, under a peace agreement, to be immediately helped and services to be restored, so that also the people can see that it is better to be in a situation where you have peace than when you have war. And the ownership of the population vis-à-vis a peace agreement is very important. If the population does not believe that the peace agreement is changing their lives for the better, is creating new conditions, is creating a new hope for them and their families, well, maybe they will make a bad decision and they want to go back to war because they will say maybe it was not so bad and we had more possibilities during the war. So the delivery of humanitarian assistance is not only humanitarian assistance, it is a message that is passed to the people that peace is better than war. Now what happens today is that, of course, humanitarian access is improving, but it is improving gradually. And we believe that, as I said, the speed of the access could be increased, but also the facilitation of the work of the international donor community that is delivering humanitarian aid. What is true is that the needs are immense. And there are many problems across the world. And you know, it is complicated for the international community to be able to mobilize so quickly the vast amount of resources that is needed for a particular conflict immediately. Because money is scarce, the numbers of needs across the planet are increasing over the last years. And of course, if the situation in a given place like Ethiopia is more complicated, well then maybe, you know, all the aid that could go and help will not be able to be mobilized as well as it could.
In the course of our discussion, you have said we don't need to have thousands and millions of IDPs or generations of IDPs. They have to go back to their original life and their livelihood as well. But rehabilitation is one of the key issues as an exit strategy. Any experience that you wanted to share to Ethiopian and government and aid organizations?
Look, to bring back the IDPs to their lands, you need to ensure security. You need to rehabilitate because very often their houses, their places, their crops have been destroyed by the war, either voluntary or not, but they are not able to go back immediately. So you need to create a conducive environment. You need to show the IDPs that it is possible to go back, that their families will be safe, and that they will be able to cater for their lives. What we can do in this, well, is obviously working with the different authorities, both the host communities, the host regions, but also the regions of origin. And we need to bring them together to see how we can find a solution in moving the IDPs back to their lands. Ethiopians should do that because this is your country, so you should have the ownership of this. But I think the international community can help with not only funding, but also the experience on how these things are being done. Because you do have experience, but here we're talking about millions of people. And it is a very difficult process to carry out because it has, you know, the dimension of it is great, but the difficulty of it is also great. There's a lack of trust. IDPs may not always feel comfortable to go back to areas where they have been under attack. So there's a whole political process that should accompany the return of IDPs. It's not only a question of we create the conditions, we give you money and you go back. It takes place within a political process where these populations can safely go back and can, you know, contribute back to the country and to the rehabilitation of their lands.
The government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia and the TPLF forces came to the negotiating table while they were at war yesterday, while changing their mind because of negotiation and intense discussion. This is also one thing. There are also diaspora communities of Ethiopia, activists, scholars, researchers, and thousands of them were living in Europe and other parts of the world. What recommendation do you have for them to support their country, to help their country as well?
This is Ethiopia, so I think all Ethiopians should help Ethiopia today, whether they are in Ethiopia or whether they are abroad. Ethiopia has a very, very large diaspora. in many parts of the world, but notably, as you mentioned, in Europe, in the United States. And I think this diaspora could have a very constructive role, in either, helping the peace process financially, politically, but also some of them, and I know some of them have already come back to Ethiopia in order to be here and concretely support, the country in a very complicated phase of its history, not only because of the conflict, but because of the consequence of the conflict on the economy, for instance. The economy is going through a very turbulent time. So my advice would be that the diaspora should have a positive outlook to helping their country and should mobilize all their power and their resources to try to bring peace to Ethiopia and not making things more complicated than they are.
The most important trade partner of Ethiopia, and there are also more than 200, close to 300 European Union companies working in Ethiopia and also creating job opportunities for really quarter of millions of Ethiopians. What will be the engagement in the future also, taking this into account, the ongoing positive and glimmer of hope in Ethiopia that we are observing today?
Well, maybe you know, but your listeners do not. The EU is the second biggest trading partner of Ethiopia, the second one, both for imports and for exports, but also for foreign direct investments. We are number 2 partner for foreign direct investments in the country. We have hundreds of European companies that are present, active in Ethiopia, creating jobs, generating growth, treating their employees according to European standards with corporate social responsibility, so bringing good practices and good values. So these companies are very active here. I had a meeting with them not later than last week, and they are all very willing to continue contributing, to this new period in which the economy of Ethiopia needs to be supported. But of course, these companies also need to be accompanied to be able to perform and give benefits to the Ethiopian economy. And for that, they need security. And as you know, in Oromia, for the time being, there are difficulties and there are insecurity. And many of our companies are located in Oromia. So this is very important to create the security conditions for them, but it's also important for them to be able, from an economic viewpoint, to have the means that they need. Forex, access to fuel and cement, taxation issues, imports issues, and so on. Because without a conducive economic environment, these companies will not be able to contribute to the rehabilitation of Ethiopia. And some of them will not invest, will not come, or, as we have seen in the past, some companies may also leave Ethiopia. And this is a very bad signal, because the companies that are here today, they are the best ambassadors to attract new investments, because they will talk to companies back in Europe and they will say, yes, it's a good place, come and invest. If they are not happy, those who are here, they will not attract investments because they will not be able to present a positive image. So I think it is very important to take care of the companies that are here because they do an important work. And as I said, there are hundreds of thousands of jobs that are being created for the Ethiopians thanks to these European companies. So my message here is really take care of them because they are contributing to Ethiopia's economy and they can bring, much more investments if the conditions are right.
Ethiopia has a good track record in peacekeeping in different parts of Africa and Europe since the early 20th century, Korea, Japan, and different African countries as well. And yet there is a persistent civil war until very recently in Ethiopia by probably meddling of foreign powers or actors and others, and also supporters from within. What recommendations and advice do you have for all Ethiopians and diaspora Ethiopians who are living abroad to maintain the peace that today we are at least enjoying it relatively in the last few months? What do they ought to do regarding maintaining their peace other than meddling with others and spoiling the peace and stability of Ethiopia?
Ethiopia has historically been a factor of stability in the region by itself, but also in helping other conflicts in the region and in Africa in sending peacekeepers, in sending troops. And Ethiopia has traditionally had a very important role in this regard. And this is something that I hope you will be able to continue in the future, because you have, of course, a big army, you have a big population, and you have the political will, you know, to contribute to the African stability. So I encourage you to continue doing this, and I think you have done very good things in the past. Now, when it comes to what is my advice for peace, I think you need to want peace. Peace doesn't come like this. You need to be willing to do whatever it takes to make peace. And this is for Ethiopians to do it. You know, there's a famous historical say that was, it's a philosopher who said, when you have a sick person, the first thing you need to ask him, if you want to cure that person, is, are you ready to give up what makes you sick? If you bring this into the peace environment, well, you need to tell people, are you ready to make whatever it takes to make peace? Peace is not something that falls out of the blue sky. It's not something that is imposed from abroad. I don't believe in this, because anything that is imposed is not owned enough by the country or by the population. It may last for a few weeks, a few months, but then it will not last, because it was not the real willingness of the people. So Ethiopian people need to understand that they will be much better off in terms of security, stability, but also prosperity if there is peace. Ethiopia has such a huge potential at all levels. You mentioned the cradle of mankind, the land of origins, but what interests me even more is what happens today. The past is the past, it is very important, but what happens today? And what happens tomorrow? It's important to remember the past, but we have to look into the future. And peace should be the future that the Ethiopians are looking at.
The stability of Ethiopia may have its own positive impact on European Union, even for the sub-region, Horn of Africa and Africa as well. What did you say regarding this? The lack of stability and security in Ethiopia, its impact vis-à-vis to the mutual interest that has to be established between Ethiopia and the European Union. The significance of Ethiopia for the whole, for Africa and for European Union as well. By this we have to conclude our discussion.
It's correct. Yes, it's correct. I mean, in this highly interdependent world, everything is connected. What happens in Ethiopia has an impact in the European Union. What happens in the European Union has an impact on Ethiopia. So we have to be aware that there are more bridges than walls in this world. And everything is interlinked, is intertwined. And of course, what happens in Ethiopia is very important to us. First of all, because we see Ethiopia as a very long-standing, as we were discussing in the beginning, a very long-standing partner and friend with which we have had very deep relationship at all levels, not only political and development aid, but trade relations, people-to-people relations. Many Ethiopians live in Europe, study in Europe. Many students are going to Europe to continue their studies. So there are very, very deep links. And so what happens in Ethiopia definitely has a bearing on Europe at many levels. And this is why we are resolutely but also stubbornly willing to help Ethiopia. But to engage in a partnership, you need the two parties to get together. So one party willing to do something with the other is not enough. The two parties need to meet and create a real partnership, a strategic partnership, as you mentioned at the beginning. But a strategic partnership is not something you just declare. It's something that should be accompanied by real actions, by strategic actions together. And this is how we are going to create a greater and greater link and friendship between Ethiopia and the European Union.
Ambassador Roland Kobia, European Ambassador to Ethiopia, thank you for your time and for your critical analysis as well.
Thank you very much to you, and I wish you already a little bit in advance but a good rest for all your listeners for the end of the year and for early January for Christmas.
By this, we have to end our program. Thank you for your being with us until we meet with another edition of the program. We will end our program. Goodbye for now. You can follow us on different social medias. Goodbye for now again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
አመሰግናለሁ።
አመሰግናለሁ. Thank you.